You probably imagine that being royalty in the past meant endless luxury palaces, shimmering with gold, silken beds, and the kind of power most people can't even dream of. But if tomorrow you awoke as a young woman inside the Sultan's harem, your chances of seeing your 30th birthday would be almost non-existent, because behind the jeweled gates of the imperial palace overlooking the Bosphorus, more than 400 women live not in paradise, but inside a prison lined with velvet. Here, your monthly cycle could sign your death warrant. Becoming pregnant without approval meant being sewn into rawhide and tossed into the sea. And after every intimate encounter, 12 officials would surround you to determine if you still deserved to keep your womb. Welcome to the shadowed side of history, the part your textbooks skip over. I'm about to take you inside the Ottoman court's most glittering nightmare, the imperial harem. Forget the fantasies painted in movies, belly dancers, sweets, and romance. This was the reality of bureaucratized femicide, disguised as luxury living. For half a millennium, the empire perfected a system so calculated that even European envoys, men who thought burning witches was reasonable, were stunned by what they saw. But here's the part few realize. None of this was random cruelty. Every punishment, every execution, every disappearance followed rules. There were forms to fill, reports to write, and supervisors to satisfy. The palace kept ledgers as precise as a modern corporation. Death was not an accident here, it was an industry. The empire wants you to remember the soaring mosques, the military victories, the art. They don't want you to recall the silver tray that sealed women's fates, the windowless chambers where girlhood ended, or the dark strait that swallowed bodies night after night. So prepare yourself. Over the next hour, I'll guide you through 7 aspects of this palace of nightmares that will change how you see history forever. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at a textbook or a palace tour the same way again. Let's begin with the ritual that made 400 women pray to remain invisible. Every evening, as the sun sank into the horizon of Constantinople, the palace became a gambling hall where the stakes weren't gold or jewels, but women's lives. Picture it. Hundreds of women, from 13 to 25 years old, dressed in finery, yet confined in the most opulent cage ever built. Each waited for the moment that could either elevate her into power or condemn her to an unmarked grave. The process was deceptively simple. A silver tray, polished to a mirror's shine, was placed inside the Sultan's private chambers. On it lay folded slips of parchment, each inscribed with a woman's name. The Sultan rarely picked himself. That would mean responsibility. Instead, his eunuchs performed the ritual, a lottery of death, where being chosen was the worst kind of prize. Imagine your name drawn from a bowl. No wealth, no recognition, just the chance that tonight you might die. And yet here's the cruelest twist: they had to act grateful. Smiling through terror, bowing as if honored, hiding every trace of fear. Any sign of reluctance, weakness, or physical impurity could trigger instant punishment. You don't learn this in school, but these women lived in constant dread of their own bodies. Palace ledgers from 1639 describe a night when the chief black eunuch, a man named Emir Khalfa, entered the harem's golden hall at precisely 8 o'clock. The women stood in rows, arranged like goods in a merchant's stall. Behind him, 2 younger eunuchs carried the silver tray, while guards forced everyone aside. The walk from the Sultan's quarters to the harem lasted 12 minutes, timed down to the second. That night, the parchment revealed the name of a 17-year-old from the Caucasus, who had already endured 3 years in the palace. But when the eunuchs came for her, they discovered she was menstruating. The empire wanted to forget what happened next. Official records list her cause of death as sudden illness. But everyone knew the truth. Her body was gone by dawn. This was the reality. Your natural biology could erase you overnight. And yet, the silver tray was only the beginning. What awaited the chosen ones behind the chamber doors was darker still. Because once selected, a woman's body was no longer hers. It became a subject for inspection, debate, and judgment. 12 eunuch physicians would surround her, deciding with chilling detachment whether her seed was worth preserving. And if they answered no, her fate was sealed before she even reached the Sultan's bed. In a palace designed to erase women, there was one girl who refused to vanish. She wasn't born noble, she wasn't raised in privilege, and yet she would bend an empire to her will. Her birth name was Anastasia Lisovska, though history would remember her by another Roxolana or Hurrem Sultan. She entered the harem as a terrified 15-year-old and left it as one of the most feared women in the Ottoman world. But to understand her rise, we need to start in the countryside of what is now Ukraine. It was the year 1519. A teenager, the daughter of a local priest, was picking flowers in the wheat fields while her father prepared for Sunday service. The village was quiet, untouched by war until the horizon filled with mounted raiders. Crimean Tatars stormed the settlement, burning homes, killing families, chaining survivors. Within hours, her childhood was ash. She was marched to the coast, sold into slavery, and loaded onto a ship bound for Istanbul. For most girls, that was the end of their story. But for Anastasia, it was the beginning of her transformation into something the palace had never seen before. When she first entered the harem, the other captives cried, begged, and broke. But she studied. She realized immediately that tears meant weakness, and weakness was fatal. So she shed her old self. She crafted a new identity, Roxolana, the laughing one, a mask of charm, wit, and obedience so convincing that even she would one day forget the girl who once picked flowers. Her first weapon was language. Palace records note that within 6 months, she spoke fluent Ottoman Turkish, along with Arabic and Persian. Witnesses described her rehearsing until her lips bled, repeating words over and over until her accent disappeared. To her, language wasn't just communication, it was camouflage. Her second weapon was observation. She treated the Sultan, Suleiman, like a puzzle. She memorized his moods, his interests, even the rhythm of his daily prayers. When he favored poetry, she became a poet. When he sought conversation on politics, she offered precisely the insights he wanted to hear. She didn't just mirror him, she made herself indispensable. What the textbooks don't tell you is how calculated her methods were. Modern psychologists would call it intermittent reinforcement, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, always unpredictable. Roxolana used uncertainty like a drug, making Suleiman crave her attention more with each encounter. And when opportunity came, she seized it with terrifying precision. In 1524, a fire broke out in the palace, a common danger in those days of oil lamps and wooden beams. While others fled, Roxolana rushed into danger to rescue Suleiman's prized manuscript of poetry. To him, it looked like selfless devotion. But forensic analysis centuries later suggested the fire began in a room only Roxolana had access to. Had she set the fire herself? If so, it was the perfect trap. By becoming the savior, she burned away every rival in a single stroke. Her greatest victory came a decade later. For centuries, Ottoman sultans never married their concubines. Marriage complicated succession and weakened royal authority. Yet Roxolana convinced Suleiman to break 500 years of tradition. Surviving letters reveal her mastery. Every phrase was designed to bind him tighter. My sultan, my soul burns when you are distant. Without your gaze, the world is darkness. On the surface, love poetry. In reality, psychological shackles. By 1534, she became his legal wife, the first and only harem woman to achieve that title. But marriage didn't mean safety. Roxolana had 6 children, but Suleiman already had an heir from another woman, Prince Mustafa. He was competent, beloved, and destined to rule, which made him Roxolana's greatest threat. She knew that in the empire's brutal logic, if Mustafa lived, her children would die, so she played her darkest hand. Over 3 years, she orchestrated a campaign of whispers. Letters forged to suggest rebellion, rumors planted in the court about Mustafa's ambition. Conversations staged for Suleiman to overhear. Every seed of doubt took root, and in 1554, Suleiman ordered his own son strangled. Roxolana watched from behind a screen as executioners tightened the silk cord around Mustafa's throat. Witnesses said she showed no emotion. The boy who might have saved the empire died, and the woman who orchestrated it ensured her children's survival. Even her poetry reveals the transformation. Verses that look like declarations of devotion read differently when you know the context. My sultan, your wisdom sees what others cannot. Your justice flows like the endless sea. Written the same week she persuaded him to kill his heir. It wasn't poetry, it was programming. She recast his paranoia as wisdom, his cruelty as justice, and his doubt as destiny. But here's the chilling truth. Roxolana wasn't a villain in the way we like to imagine. She was a survivor. In a system designed to consume women, she discovered the only path to live was to become more ruthless than her captors. She built a network of spies within the palace, controlled resources, orchestrated deaths, Some historians call her a feminist icon who shattered barriers. Others call her a war criminal wrapped in jewels. Both are true. When she died in 1559, she became the only woman in Ottoman history to be buried beside a sultan. She had won the game, but the cost was her humanity. And while Roxolana mastered survival by turning into a predator, most women in the harem had no such option. They remained prey, fodder for a killing machine disguised as a palace. The Ottomans didn't just kill, they refined killing into an art form. Every method had purpose, every death had paperwork, every disposal had a budget line. The harem wasn't only a prison of women, it was a factory of endings. The problem, from the empire's perspective, was that they needed to eliminate women regularly, but Islamic law forbade spilling royal blood. Public executions, messy beheadings, or bloody punishments common in Europe weren't an option. The solution? Innovate. They created a system of clean murder. Death that was silent, bloodless, and efficient. The stranglers. The palace employed men known as bostanci, the gardeners. Their official duty was tending the sultan's grounds. Their hidden duty was tending his human garden. Selected for discretion, trained in anatomy, they perfected the act of strangulation with silk cords. The technique was standardized. 3 feet of silk twisted 7 times, placed around the neck, tightened in a single practice motion. One man held the victim still, while another pulled. If it took longer than 45 seconds, the executioner himself faced punishment for unnecessary cruelty. Imagine that performance reviews for murder. Silk left no marks, spilled no blood, and satisfied the letter of the law. To the clerics, it was a merciful death. To the women, it was terror woven into fabric. But the true torture wasn't physical, it was psychological. Victims were informed at sunset and killed at sunrise, given one night to prepare their souls. Many spent those hours writing desperate letters to families that would never receive them. The sack. If strangulation was considered merciful, the deniz cezası, the sea punishment, was hell itself. Women who became pregnant without official permission were sewn into rawhide sacks along with cats. The animals weren't there for company, they were there to panic, claw, and thrash, ensuring the woman couldn't stay still long enough to float. Execution squads had a special black-painted boat used only on moonless nights. They rowed into the Bosphorus, far enough that the current would drag the sack into the Black Sea. The bodies vanished with the tide. From 1,520 to 1,680, palace records show at least 3,000 women met their end this way, nearly 20 every year for a century and a half. Fishermen whispered of mermaid graveyards, stretches of water they refused to cast nets into because they pulled up more bones than fish. And disturbingly, officials considered this progressive. Compared to European kingdoms burning women alive, the Ottomans thought drowning was merciful. Banishment. Not every disposal ended in death. Some were condemned to the Eski Saray, the old palace, a crumbling building on the city's outskirts. It became a warehouse for women past their prime or guilty of minor offences. One French diplomat described it in 1669. A marble tomb filled with living phantoms. Women who enter as maidens emerge as corpses, if they emerge at all. No visitors, no letters. Just silence so complete that the women developed their own sign language, communicating with hand motions because speaking aloud was discouraged. They weren't executed, but they ceased to exist. Psychological erasure instead of physical. Creative cruelty. The most disturbing punishments were reserved for women who attempted escape. They faced taş duvar cezası, the stone punishment. Not stoning, worse. They were sealed alive inside palace walls. Archaeologists renovating the palace in 2010 discovered skeletons hidden in mortar, confirming centuries-old rumors. Others received poisoned sherbet, a sweet almond-flavored drink laced with cyanide, reserved for higher status women whose blood couldn't be spilled and whose bodies couldn't be found floating in the sea. Death was tailored to rank. A concubine might face a cord. A mother of princes might sip poison. Escapees became bricks in the architecture. Murder matched status. The economics of death. And yes, it all had a price tag. Palace ledgers list the costs. Strangulation with silk, 3 akçe, the cost of a simple meal. Sack drownings, 20 akçe, accounting for the boat crew and leather. Banishment, nearly free, just a one-time transfer. Murder was literally a line item in the imperial budget. Even the men who carried out these acts paid a price. Records show palace executioners suffered higher rates of night terrors and depression than any other staff. One journal, found in 1989, contained 400 pages of apologies addressed to unnamed women, the killer himself begging forgiveness from his victims. Religious sanction. How did the empire justify this? Clerics issued fatwas declaring rebellious women as corrupters of harmony. Their deaths were not just permissible but pious. Holy words became execution orders. This twisted theology turned silk cords into sacraments, poison into purification, walls into tombs sanctified by faith. By now, you might think you've seen the worst of the palace system. But women weren't the only ones consumed. Because if you thought the harem was horrific, wait until you hear about the boys. The Ottomans didn't wait for slaves to come to them. They went out and collected children in a system so efficient it makes modern trafficking look amateur. It was called devshirm, the gathering, and it transformed whole regions into hunting grounds for sons. Got it. Here's part 3, rewritten again. Without any titles inside the script, it will flow as pure narration, just like a finished YouTube script for TTS. The Ottomans didn't simply kill. They perfected the act, stripping it of blood, noise, and spectacle, until death itself became an administrative routine. Every execution had a protocol, every disappearance had a cost, everybody was accounted for like entries in a ledger. What looked like cruelty from the outside was, inside the palace, a system. The empire faced a problem. Islamic law forbade spilling royal blood, and the Sultan's dignity demanded quiet, dignified deaths. Public beheadings or messy punishments that Europe embraced were unacceptable. The solution was innovation. They created methods of execution that were efficient, silent, and left no trace. Among the most chilling were the men known as the gardeners. Officially, they tended the palace grounds, but their hidden duty was pruning the Sultan's human garden. Trained in anatomy, they specialized in strangulation with silk cords. The technique was precise: 3 feet of silk, twisted 7 times for strength, looped quickly around the throat. One man pinned the victim, another pulled. If the death took longer than 45 seconds, the executioner himself could be punished for causing unnecessary suffering. Murder had performance reviews. Silk was chosen for its silence. It left no blood, no scars, no visible mark. To the clerics, this was mercy. To the victims, it was terror woven into fabric. But the greater cruelty was psychological. Women chosen for strangulation were informed at sunset and killed at sunrise. They had one final night to wait, knowing the exact hour they would die. Many wrote desperate letters to families who would never receive them, their words buried alongside their bodies. Worse still was the sea punishment. Women who became pregnant outside official sanction were sewn into rawhide sacks with live cats. The animals thrashed and clawed inside the bag, preventing the victim from staying still or holding breath. Execution squads used a black-painted boat on moonless nights, rowing out into the Bosphorus. There, the sacks were dumped where the currents would sweep them into the Black Sea. Records show more than 3,000 women died this way between the 16th and 17th centuries. Local fishermen told of waters haunted by bones, places they refused to cast nets into because the sea seemed to breathe with ghosts. Disturbingly, officials considered this humane. Compared to Europe's pyres, drowning was progress. Not every punishment ended in immediate death. Some were banished to the Old Palace, a decaying building on the city's edge. Women sent there lived in silence, without letters, without visitors. They became shadows, forgotten before they died. One foreign diplomat described it as a marble tomb filled with breathing corpses. The women developed their own sign language to survive the silence, because speaking aloud was discouraged. They weren't executed, but they were erased. The most dreadful fate awaited those who tried to flee. They were walled alive inside the palace itself. For centuries, whispers claimed that concubines who vanished became part of the structure. In 2010, renovations revealed skeletons inside the stone, confirming what had been dismissed as rumor. Other women of higher status received poisoned sherbet, a sweet almond-flavored drink that ended life in hours. Their deaths were tailored to their rank. A concubine received a cord, a mother of princes, a cup of poison. An escapee became part of the palace walls. Even murder had an economy. Ledgers show the price of silk strangulation as 3 silver coins, the cost of a meal. Drownings cost 20, accounting for the boat crew and leather sack. Banishment cost almost nothing beyond transport. Death was budgeted like food or clothing. The men who carried out these orders paid a hidden price. Palace medical records show executioners suffered higher rates of melancholy and night terrors than any other servants. One journal, discovered in the late 20th century, held hundreds of pages of apologies written to unnamed women, the words of a man who killed for a living but begged his victims for forgiveness. The empire's clerics provided the justification. Religious rulings declared that women who disrupted harmony were spreading corruption, and their elimination was not only permitted but required. Holy verses became authorizations for strangulation and drowning. Murder was sanctified as order, cruelty disguised as piety. By now, the horrors of the women's prison seem complete. But the Ottoman machine consumed more than daughters and brides. It reached far beyond palace walls, harvesting children by the thousands. If you thought the harem was a nightmare, what happened to the empire's stolen sons will leave you speechless. Understood here is Part 4, rewritten in the same pure narration style, flowing naturally for TTS without section titles. The empire's hunger did not stop with women. It reached into villages and tore away children, turning boys into soldiers, servants, and shadows of themselves. This system was known as the Dev Shirme, the collection, and it was nothing less than state-sanctioned child abduction. Every 3 to 7 years, officials spread across conquered lands, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania, arriving before dawn to surround villages. Christian boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were ordered into the town square. Muslim families were exempt, which created a twisted incentive to convert, though conversions were often denied when convenient. The inspection was brutal. Children were stripped naked, examined for defects, their teeth checked as if they were horses, their bodies measured like livestock. Quotas had to be met. If a province lacked enough candidates, standards dropped. In desperate years, boys as young as 6 or as old as 20 were taken. The only unbreakable rule was faith. They had to be Christian. Only then could they be reshaped without the protections of Islamic law. Once chosen, they were branded or tattooed, marked forever as property of the Sultan. The march to Istanbul began immediately. Groups of 100 were chained together and forced to walk hundreds of miles. From the Balkans, some boys travelled nearly 1,000 miles on foot. No wagons, no horses. Suffering was part of the process. 1 in 5 never survived the journey. Their deaths on the road were considered acceptable losses, natural selection for future soldiers. Witnesses compared the marches to rivers of children flowing toward Constantinople. Mothers followed at a distance until soldiers drove them back. Some families maimed their sons, cutting fingers or toes to make them unfit. Others married them off early, since married boys were sometimes exempt. In the most desperate cases, parents killed their own sons rather than see them taken. Those who survived arrived broken and exhausted. Their names were stripped away, replaced with Muslim names. Circumcision marked them physically, often without anesthesia. They were forbidden from speaking their native tongues or practicing their original faith. Boys caught praying in secret faced severe beatings. The goal was complete erasure of identity. The transformation did not end with language or ritual. The boys were placed in palace schools where they learned obedience, combat, and administration. But the most sinister part was how the system turned victims into enforcers. Older boys, already broken, became the overseers of newcomers. The empire didn't need to inflict trauma on every child. Children inflicted it on each other. European observers were horrified. An Austrian ambassador in 1562 wrote that Christian children were returned as enemies of Christ, loyal enough to slaughter their own kin. He called it a factory that manufactured weapons from souls. The numbers tell the story. Between 1,450 and 1,650, roughly 200,000 boys were taken. That's 1,000 children each year for 2 centuries. Entire regions lost generations of sons. Villages recorded decades where no boys aged 10 to 18 remained. The trauma etched itself into folklore songs of child-stealing demons, legends of vanishing sons, nightmares that still echo in Balkan memory. Not all outcomes were the same. Some boys became janissaries, the empire's most feared infantry. Others rose to grand viziers, governors, commanders. Defenders of the system point to these rare cases of power, claiming opportunity was given. But for every 1 boy who rose, 99 disappeared into obedience or death. The argument is the same traffickers use today, that slavery is opportunity dressed as misfortune. The most delicate boys, the cleverest and most beautiful, were sent not to the barracks, but to the palace schools. There they studied calligraphy, theology, music, mathematics, and something far darker. The lessons did not stop at books or swordplay. They were groomed, paraded before officials, rented out under the guise of mentorship. The palace even taxed these arrangements, turning abuse into revenue. Medical records describe injuries hidden under euphemism: fissures, throat inflammation, sudden melancholy, suicides disguised as accidents. One guard's diary listed 31 boys who fell from the same tower in 5 years. The tower had railings. Everyone knew why they jumped. Religion was twisted into chains. Palace clerics declared that serving seniors was a form of worship, that obedience equaled holiness. Boys were told their suffering made them better, that resistance meant weakness of faith. In such logic, pain became prayer. And yet, for the empire, the system worked. These stolen children became administrators, generals, loyal servants with no ties to family or land. Their trauma bonded them to each other and to the very structure that had broken them. Other empires tried to copy it, though none matched the Ottoman efficiency. One escaped boy, who reached Venice in 1701, left behind a rare confession. They took my name, my faith, my childhood. They gave me knowledge and power and nightmares that will never end. I speak 7 languages, but I scream in the one my mother taught me. For 4 centuries, this was official policy, written into law, administered by bureaucrats, enforced by soldiers, and normalized by tradition. The Devshirme did not end because of morality. It ended when guns made elite infantry less useful, and when Muslim families began bribing officials to include their children. The system collapsed under its own contradictions, not out of compassion. But the damage had already been done. Generations lost their sons, and thousands of children grew into men who carried both power and scars. The empire's brilliance in administration came at the cost of human lives, harvested like crops. And yet, even this wasn't the end of the palace's appetite. Because the same schools that taught mathematics and poetry also taught children that their bodies were commodities. Behind marble walls and painted tiles, the empire ran a grooming factory disguised as education. The machine could not last forever. Empires fall, but systems of abuse rarely collapse because of morality. They collapse when they stop working. For the Ottoman Harem, it took the slow decay of the entire empire to bring an end to 5 centuries of systematic enslavement and disposal. The 19th century brought outside pressure. European powers demanded reforms, while voices inside the empire began questioning traditions that had long been untouchable. In 1839, Sultan Abdulmesid issued the Tanzimat reforms, promising modernization and rights, yet even then, the harem was exempt. Decrees that outlawed slavery, in theory, carved out exceptions for the sultan's household in practice. It was like abolishing chains everywhere, except the palace. Resistance was fierce. Eunuchs who had spent their lives enforcing the system fought to preserve it. Clerics issued new rulings declaring reform sinful. Senior women, who had survived by becoming part of the structure, resisted as well. To them, freedom was not liberation, but a threat to the fragile power they had clawed from captivity. Change came not through compassion but through force. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution swept through the empire. Soldiers stormed the palace, documented what they found, and began releasing women. Some had been inside since childhood. One woman, freed at 60, admitted she no longer knew her real name. When offered freedom, she begged to stay. The outside world was more terrifying than the only life she had ever known. The palace became a museum in 1924. Workers discovered hidden rooms bricked off, bones under floors, skeletons sealed into walls. 17 burial sites in total, quietly reburied without fanfare. Tourists now wander the same halls, admiring the tiles and fountains, taking photographs where women once awaited the silver tray. The guides speak of concubines and intrigue. The silk cords and leather sacks are left out of the story. Modern Turkey's relationship with this past remains uneasy. Textbooks celebrate architecture and culture, but reduce the harem to footnotes. Television dramas romanticize it as love and jewels, transforming Roxolana into a heroine, erasing the blood on her hands and the screams in the corridors. History has been sanitized for entertainment, yet evidence keeps surfacing. In 2010, construction unearthed a mass grave near the palace walls, young women, nearly all between 15 and 25, many showing signs of violence. The remains were quietly relocated, the past buried once more, but paper trails are harder to hide. Digitized archives reveal sales receipts for girls, budgets for silk cords, orders for poison. Every cruelty left a mark in the bureaucracy. The system wrote its own indictment. Numbers cut through denial. 400 women entered, and on average 3 survived to old age. For every Roxolana who rose to power, more than 100 simply vanished. The turnover was relentless. Records show the harem population replaced itself every 5 years. That means over 5 centuries, nearly 200,000 women passed through this prison of silk and marble. The lessons are not ancient. Human trafficking today enslaves an estimated 40 million people. Forced marriages, child soldiers, hidden prisons, different costumes, the same logic. Whenever humans are treated as property, horror follows. Whenever tradition excuses cruelty, cruelty becomes tradition. Whenever profit outweighs dignity, suffering is rationalized. Tourists leave the palace with perfume labeled harem nights. Couples pose for wedding photos in courtyards fertilized with bones. Beauty masks brutality, just as it did centuries ago. The danger is not in remembering, but in forgetting, because forgetting makes repetition possible. Think of the silver tray one last time, a simple object that carried slips of paper with women's names. For them, it was destiny disguised as chance. Some prayed to be chosen, believing power meant safety. Others prayed to be ignored, hoping invisibility meant survival. Both prayers were answered with the same silence. Behind every statistic was a person. Behind every tradition, a tragedy. Behind every jewel, blood. The harem was not romance. It was the most beautiful death factory in human history. And the most chilling truth of all is that it wasn't run by monsters. It was run by ordinary people. Clerics, guards, servants, women turned wardens. People who went home to their families at night. Systems of cruelty do not need demons. They only need humans willing to obey. Tonight, you will go to bed without fearing a silver tray. Your natural biology will not be grounds for execution. Your children will not be collected by soldiers at dawn. You exist outside of any human inventory. That freedom feels normal, but for centuries it was unimaginable. So remember, the harem ended not because rulers grew merciful, but because the empire collapsed. Systems of abuse rarely reform themselves, they must be broken apart. Every right we take for granted today was written in the blood of those who lived without them. 400 entered, 3 survived, and the warning they leave us is simple. Beauty can hide horror, tradition can normalize atrocity, and humans can adapt to anything, even the unthinkable. The palace still stands as a museum. Let it remain there, studied, remembered, but never romanticized and never repeated.